Welcome you to this year's Russia conference. Every year we at NUPI try to bring together scholars and decision makers to reflect on some of the key developments in Russia. And this is actually the 27th annual conference on Russia. It's quite amazing. Thanks to all of you for attending this conference and for supporting us in this initiative. Welcome to, I should say also welcome to all of you who follow us on the streaming, if they are here, and you can watch this conference and also the previous conferences on NUPI's YouTube channel. Now, this year's conference is also co-organized together with the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, so thank you so much to Arild Moe and his team for excellent cooperation. Now, we are meeting today while the war still rages in Ukraine, with huge sacrifices and massive destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure, schools, buildings, and other things. But the Ukrainians keep fighting with considerable strength. During the last few days, we have seen how the Russians have had to withdraw from Kherson, and it seems that the Ukrainians have no signs of stopping at the banks. Yesterday, President Zelensky said that we are perhaps also about to see the beginning of the end of the war. During this war, we have seen that the economy and energy has become weaponized. Russia has cut off much of its supply of energy to Europe, and Europe wants Russia out of its energy systems. Europe and the US and others have also introduced wide-ranging sanctions towards Russian businesses, persons, and reduced their access to technology. In addition, thousands of businesses and investors have voluntarily divested and pulled out of Russia. In short, we have seen a massive commitment to economic decoupling that I think very few imagined could be possible just a few months ago. So at the conference today, we will examine the impact of the war in Ukraine on the prospect for Russian economy and the Russian energy sector. I think that at least three big questions and topics will be examined. Let me just run through what I think is the most important topics. So first, how is the Russian economy performing during this war? So estimates vary. OECD estimates that the Russian economy will drop by 5.5% in 2022, while the World Bank estimates it will drop with close to 9%. But of course, these estimates are difficult. It's also unclear if the poor economic performance will have any implication on the decision-making in Russia, on the political stability of Russia, and its willingness to continue to engage in the war. So that's another topic, so to say. Secondly, Russian economy has for a long time had many structural difficulties with aging population, plummeting birth rate, corruption, poor institutions, and also poor infrastructure. Now, add to this the more recent disruption in the energy flows, the sanctions, the outflow of talents, and the rapid deterioration in the possibilities of doing business. So what are now the updated prospects for the Russian economy in the short, medium, and long term? And finally, as we meet, there is also a meeting in Egypt on the COP27 on the climate, and the climate is, of course, a huge concern. It's a shared global concern. And given the fact that Russia has been the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels, of oil, gas, and coal, how can Russia cope with a world of decarbonization and green transition? So those are the key topics for today's conference. And we are glad and happy that we have gathered some of the leading experts on Russian economy and the energy sector, and I think this will be an exciting conference. Let me also thank Indra Øverland and Arild Moe and the communication department at NUPI for their efforts in putting this together. I'm particularly pleased that Anniken Huitfeldt, the Norwegian Foreign Minister, has accepted to come here and give her opening remarks. Anniken Huitfeldt, she came here last year as well, right after being appointed foreign minister. So she is almost like a strong supporter for this conference. So thank you so much. For us as researchers, it's really important, I think, that you as a foreign minister take interest in our work. And we are grateful the way you stimulate the dialogue and exchanges between academics and decision makers. So, Minister, it's great to have you back here. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for the invitation to open NUPI's Russia conference. As Ulf just said, I also gave the opening speech last year. Then I mentioned that I recently met Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov in Tromsø. I had been the Minister of Foreign Affairs for 10 days, Lavrov for 17 years. He said that he found me very direct, even aggressive. But I still found it to be a positive meeting that offered hope of increased contact and cooperation. 1 year. Looking at everything that has happened since 24th of February, it seems like much, much longer ago. For 9 months, Russia has been waging a brutal war of conquest against Ukraine, with the assistance of the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. Thousands of civilians have been killed and wounded, including many children. There are chilling reports about forced evacuation of Ukrainians from occupied areas to Russia, thousands of children among them. The behavior of Russian forces in Ukraine raises the questions, which Russia are we facing? When faced with the question, I'm grateful for the insight and input from many people in this room. In the early 1990s, we had hope. As Foreign Minister, Thorvald Stoltenberg fathered the Barents Cooperation, built on much of the same thinking that underpinned European integration after the Second World War. We were hoping that a reborn Russia would become like us. This hope was dashed within a few years, but it happened gradually. There were bright spots along the way, and we worked for a long time to engage Russia in broad international cooperation, in the belief that this would contribute positively to a democratic and prosperous Russia. We were right to try. But our effort failed. On the 24th of February, this became clear for everyone. Russia rejected dialogue. Instead, it chose a war of aggression. This is the Russia we are facing now, and in the foreseeable future. A radicalized regime with clear totalitarian features. A regime that violates international law, that violates the human rights and fundamental freedoms of their own citizens, that is waging a brutal war against a neighboring country. And that poses a threat to our and our allies' interests. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia has underestimated Western unity and overestimated its own power and influence. There are signs that the course of the war may have changed. On the battlefield, Ukraine now has the initiative. Europe's dependence on Russian gas is coming to an end with Norwegian assistance. For Russia, the invasion of Ukraine has been a massive miscalculation. But the war is not over. We must be prepared for worse. Our resolve will be tested in the coming months. Ukraine will continue to need large-scale support. Putin is trying to force the Ukrainians on their knees by attacking power stations and other civilian targets. History has shown that such attacks fail, and they will fail now. They stiffen the Ukrainians' determination to resist. But Ukraine needs all the help it can get through this winter and in the coming years. Together with our partners, Norway will continue to stand up for Ukraine, and we will contribute substantially to the rebuilding of Ukraine. In Russia, there is increasing concern about the consequences of the war. Mobilization has brought the war home to the Russian population. As a result, public discontent is growing. There is increased uncertainty about the political situation in Russia, about the degree of political stability. I will not speculate today, but we know that Russia has undergone rapid and dramatic political changes before. We must be prepared that this can happen again. In December last year, Russia warned of serious military and political consequences if Sweden and Finland joined NATO. For Finland, maybe that was a reminder of the so-called Friendship Treaty of 1948. So the Russian threats were counterproductive. During this year, the security policy in Europe has changed dramatically. Sweden and Finland are in the process of joining NATO, and this will strengthen the alliance. And our security, it will also strengthen. And it will contribute to a common approach to the defense of Northern Europe. Without Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this would not have happened, at least not yet. Another sign that by invading Ukraine, Putin made a mistake. Having Russia as a neighbor requires us to maintain flexibility in our Russia policy. At the same time, it is more important than ever to work for a common Russian policy among our partners and allies. European countries have had different approaches to Russia over the years. There have been diverging views on the need for cooperation and the need for deterrence, on the value of close economic ties and mutual dependence in the field of energy. Norway's view has been shaped by our NATO membership, but also by our close ties with Russia in the north, by our pragmatic and practical cooperation with Russia, and by our history, in particular the liberation of Eastern Finnmark during the Second World War. But this experience is different from our partners who suffered from decades of Soviet occupation. For the past 10 years, these various views on Russia have converged. We can now speak of a more united approach to Russia, in particular after the 24th. We still have to balance deterrence and reassurance. High north, low tension is still in the future what we are working towards. We will continue to cooperate in areas where Norway and Russia have common interests. But we will not explore new areas of cooperation with a regime that is conducting a brutal aggression against a neighboring state. And we have frozen most of the government-to-government cooperation with Russia. Russia's behavior in the international organizations is far from constructive. Russia uses the UN Security Council and the OSCE institutions as platforms to spread disinformation, thereby undermining the institutions that we depend on. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned Finland's historical experience with the so-called Friendship Treaty. As many of you know, Soviet offered efforts were not limited to only Finland. For many years, the Soviet Union sought a friendship treaty with Norway. In 1980, Foreign Minister Knut Frydenlund traveled to Moscow to meet the Foreign Minister Gromyko. Moscow sought to repair some of their relationship with the West after the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Frydenlund had made it clear that such a treaty was not even a topic of discussion during the visit. But during a coffee break, Gromyko couldn't help himself. Why were Norway so opposed to the treaty of friendship with a friendly neighbor? Frydenlund, with a wry smile, responded, 20 years ago, I accompanied Foreign Minister Halvard Lange on a visit to Moscow. The Soviet foreign minister was named Gromyko even then. The proposed friendship treaty was brought up, and I remember particularly well what you, as an argument, an example in favor of such a treaty, mentioned. You mentioned the treaty you had just signed with Afghanistan. Gromyko did not bring it up again. Good discussions require knowledge. In this bleak situation, we need your knowledge and expertise more than ever. This is why your work is of utmost importance for me and for the government, but it's also important for the Norwegian society and as a contribution to informed debate about our relationship with Russia. I wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our first panel on the Russian economies and sanctions against Russia. My name is Roman Vakulchuk. I'm Senior Research Fellow at NUPI. And it's my big pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Iika Korhonen, who is the economist and head of research at the Bank of Finland Institute for Economies in Transition. Iika, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roman. And ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, I'd like to thank very much NUPI for the kind invitation to talk to you today about, as you can see, about Russia's economy and sanctions. So I will offer brief remarks on where we are now, and then at the end I will try to speculate what happens next in Russia's economy. But first, I think it is sort of good to remember where we were before the war, or where Russia's economy was before the war. It's good to remember that Russia was actually growing very slowly, also before the war. The sort of heady days of early 2000s, when price of oil kept rising and Russia's economy was growing at 6%, 7%, 8% a year, that stopped after the global financial crisis. Russia's economic growth became slower and more volatile, not just because of sanctions, but for example, in 2015, the contraction in Russia's economy was clearly caused by the Western sanctions after the illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine. The reasons for this are, of course, manifold. First, demographics. Russia's working age population has been declining since 2010. Of course, in this, Russia is not alone. Many other countries in the world are in a similar position. But I would also contend that Putin's terms in Putin coming back to the post of president of Russia, and the policy actions after that have contributed. Whatever else we might think of Dmitry Medvedev and his presidency, in terms of economic policy and legislation related to commercial activity, he was actually fairly progressive. There were many instances where the authorities' ability to actually extract rents from companies was limited. All that was rolled back after 2012, and moreover, the repression of the Russian state clearly became more intense after the demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 2012. You can see this, for example, in how private companies and actually also state-owned companies reacted in their investment decisions. Investments, I mean fixed capital investments in Russia, so investments in future productive capacity actually peaked in 2013. So before Crimea and before sanctions, they already started to decline. And I would say this is a clear example of companies reacting to more repressive regime. And now war, uncertainty, sanctions, companies leaving Russia, so-called self-sanctioning, all of this is now serving only to escalate, only to make all these existing problems worse. So the next few years for Russia's economy will not be very, very good. Then I will briefly talk about some of the sanctions. I would contend that at least up until now, sanctions related to foreign trade, so export controls, export bans on goods going to Russia, and then, as I said, companies deciding to leave Russia, even if their products would not be on the sanctions list, has had a major effect on Russian economy. So, at the moment, Russia's imports are roughly 30% below the pre-war level. And in this picture, I mean, we don't have all the countries that Russia trades with, but these are Russia's main trading partners. And I should add that after the start of the war, Russia has ceased to publish its foreign trade data. So we have to actually collect all of this from the partner countries' data. You can clearly see in the bottom how exports from the major EU countries, from the US, UK, have collapsed after the start of the war. We can also see that exports from China have recovered more or less to their pre-war level. So before the war, China accounted for roughly 1/4 of Russia's imports. Now this share must be well over 1/3, perhaps even 40%. This means that on the import side, Russia is now, if not the world's most dependent country on China, then perhaps the second most dependent country on China after North Korea. We can also see, if we look at, say, exports from India, Turkey, and so on. Even though, for example, Turkey's exports to Russia have recovered and have actually now, in the recent months, grown quite a bit, they are still very, very small portion of Chinese exports to Russia. So this link, and as I said, Russia's economic dependence on China has become only stronger, and I would think will only grow stronger over time. No other country, not India, not Vietnam, not Turkey, comes even close to China's importance. And it's actually good to note that when one looks at Chinese data, China's exports to Russia are basically China's traditional goods, textiles, electronics, consumer electronics, various types of machinery and equipment. But all those goods that have been sanctioned by other countries, those products, their exports to Russia have actually grown more slowly than overall exports. So at least so far it seems that China is not a major conduit of these sanctioned goods for Russian importers. And then at the end, I will speculate. Predicting future, of course, is not an easy task, not a very, or you will always get something wrong, but at the same time, we need to think about future and at least offer some plausible scenarios for future. It's clear that when the EU import ban on crude oil comes into force, this will have an effect on Russia's export. That the volumes cannot stay where they are at the moment. So far, the declining import of crude oil from Russia in Europe, Russia has been able to more or less one-to-one replace that with growing exports to China and especially growing exports to India. Going forward, this is most likely not possible, perhaps even for such a simple reason as there are not enough oil tankers in the world to really ship all that oil all the way from Russia to China and India instead of, say, Finland or Rotterdam. At the same time, Russia's natural gas exports to the EU have collapsed, and this will have a big effect on Russia's economy going forward. So we are now forecasting that Russia's GDP will decline in 22 and 23 altogether 7-8%. This is not 15% or 20%, as some people suggested in March, but still this is clearly much stronger response than, say, in 2014 and 15. But obviously also the sanctions are now much stronger. Russia's declining export volumes and lower export prices have already resulted in budget deficit. So Russia's government, or the federal government budget, has been in deficit since June. And then, of course, if one, say, looks at the budget proposal for next year and then tries to come up with some reasonable scenarios for energy exports, and we should remember that roughly 40% of tax revenue at the federal level comes from energy sector. It's not very, it's actually quite likely that budget deficit will be at least 4% of GDP. It might be even higher, depending on how much money Russia needs to spend fighting its illegal war in Ukraine. Then on the production side, this big drop in imports has already had a very bad effect on many sectors of Russian economy, especially in manufacturing industry. So basically all sectors, manufacturing plants that had been relying on foreign components that were part of global production networks, production has collapsed. So a lot of people talk about car manufacturing decline between 60 and 70% year on year, but there are many other sort of narrow sectors, whether it's elevators or television sets or radios. Production has dropped by more than 50%. Even things like railway cars, production down by one third, because they are unable to get high quality ball bearings. So these all kinds of small things are happening, which when taken together are actually eroding Russia's capability to produce sort of more high-tech, more complex goods for its civilian use, but also for military use. At the same time, we should remember that sanctions alone, they are not a silver bullet that will stop fighting. For now, sanctions, companies exiting the market, they have already reduced Russia's tax revenue. In the future, they will reduce tax revenue even more. We have already sort of made it more difficult for Russia to replace the military equipment that they are losing in Ukraine. I think the longer the sanctions are in place, this effect will actually be even more acute. No Chinese Chinese imports have not been enough to offset the components lost, and I don't think they will do so in the future either. So we will need also other tools, direct help to Ukraine in many forms, but obviously sanctions will remain in the toolbox, and they have been very effective, as I said, in limiting Russia's ability to replace the things that it is currently losing in Ukraine. And I think I'll stop here, and then we'll have the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ika, for your introductory presentation. I think it was great in terms of setting the scene for our discussion. It's my big pleasure to introduce to you other panelists who are joining me on the... could you just take a seat there? Because thanks. Who are joining me in our discussion. The first panelist is Ingrid Marie Opdal, who is Associate Professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Thank you for joining us. The next panelist is Cecilie Senstad, who is a Senior Fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And the third panelist is my colleague Arne Melchior, who is a Senior Researcher at NUPI. Thank you very much for joining, and just a few words about how we move forward in terms of our discussion. First, each of the panelists will make a short introductory statement. And after that, we will get to the internal Q&A session, and then open the opportunity for the audience also to ask your questions. And first on the list is Arne Melchior. Arne, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall I sit here?
Yeah, you can sit.
So thank you very much. There's strong flashlights, but I see many people, so nice to see so many here. Also, thanks to Ilkka Koronen for his interesting presentation at the start. We had a joint project at NUPI a few years back, where BOFIT was the main partner. Also, David Tarr, who will be in the second panel, participated. We also had Russian colleagues from Zephyr in Moscow in this project. They are unfortunately not here. I really hope that in some foreseeable future, the insane war will end and we will return to normality. So we will also have our Russian colleagues present in the discussions. So in these first remarks, I would like to catch on to the remarks made on trade sanctions and how if trade sanctions could be undermined by other countries, replacing, for example, imports from Europe to Russia or providing the revenue that Russia needs from its exports. So the picture here is, of course, that it's incomplete in the sense that data are not complete because monthly data for trade are not available for all countries. Russia has not reported to international institutions. China has not reported since March. But we have some data and some sources. I looked at the Comtrade data and the Bruegel trade tracker, which you may look at. And Ilkka Koronen showed some of the pattern here that China, the imports into Russia from China, which is mainly industrial goods in exchange for commodities from Russia, it was reduced strongly after the war started, but it has returned to normal. But China has not gone all in a sense, and replaced European exports to Russia. China and the EU are the kind of main suppliers of industrial goods to Russia. And Buffett has also made some interesting work on the technological substitutability, whether China or other countries in Asia can replace European supplies to Russia. So on the export side, you see clearly that India and China have increased their fuel imports from Russia. Turkey has increased their imports of other goods from Russia. And as noted in the press, Russia has given rebates on fuel prices to some countries, which plays a role for their exports. So for Europe, Ilkka Koronen showed that for the large countries, the exports per month was less than €1 billion per month. If you look at the EU in total, the figure is kind of 4 billion, is a bit larger. So there is, of course, not a full trade ban, but however you look at it, there has been a kind of strong reduction in the exports and trade with Russia. So the sanctions bite, and they inflict economic strain on Russia. I think from the picture it's evident that China is a major player. And also there is, of course, in general, the possibility that other countries may replace shipments from Europe. So the broadest possible alliance and coalition in trade and trade sanctions is important. I saw in today's newspapers that there were some constructive new signals from the meetings between Biden and Xi in the G20 arena, or linked to the G20 meetings. So, of course, the polarization between the USA and China may play a kind of adverse role also related to the Ukraine war. I think the European summit was also a constructive contribution, important to involve countries in Eastern Europe. My greatest fear, is my final word, is that Eastern Europe will become a kind of a valley of the shades with low growth and weak development for the decades to come. That applies to all the countries, Ukraine and Russia included. So this war has to end to create growth and prosperity in Eastern Europe as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arne. I think it's very relevant, and I think you've touched upon several very important topics, including the issues related to technological development and which roles other countries can play, as well as issues related to import substitution policies, but I'm sure we can touch upon them during the Q&A session. Next, please, Cecilia, if you can take the floor.
Okay, thank you. So I'll actually continue on the part that Ilkka so well spoke about public income and public expenditures, because it's really important for the ability to spend money on defense. And as we already have spoken about, the public budget is really dependent upon the petro income. It has normally been around 30% for previous years. This year it peaked until 40% because of the high oil and gas prices, which made it possible for Russia to increase their spending on defense mostly. They increased expenditures by 16%, while income increased by 11%. They had actually planned for a surplus this year. So they were able to spend a lot more money on defense without cutting other expenditures. The defense budget increased by 50%, but me and my colleague Julie, we looked at the budget and found a lot of other posts as well, where it probably increased spending on defense. So when you include all those expenditures, it seems like defense-related or Ukraine-related expenditures means that the defense-related expenditures have been doubled since last year. And they don't plan to cut it next year either. So this defense spending will keep up. Furthermore, we see that the income will fall, so they need to finance this somehow. The welfare fund is they still have access to about half of it. They have spent 20% of it until now, but as you see, it's only 10% of GDP, and they only have access to half of it, so it's not possible to use to replace the whole income by that. And then last year, the GDP dropped and was in 2020 due to the COVID pandemics. They replaced it by increasing public debt, but now it costs more to finance the Russian public debt, so it will be increasing expenditure in the future. So that will also demand a large part of the public budget, which means that it will be less left for all other things, for education and health, while increasing the defense spending. When it comes to the defense industry, they will probably lack sufficient input factors. There have been reports about Western components in arms that they have seen in Ukraine. They're not set up for these production levels, which means you have to organize everything into there and increase production lines, which is really costly, which means that you don't get one-to-one out of how much money you put in and what you get out of it. So they will probably see a high cost increase. So to summarize, the budget future, you will see increased defense spending. They will get more defense out of it, but not as much money as they put into it, and they have to cut back on all other public expenditures. Those are effects from sanctioning the Russian economy.
Thanks a lot, Cecilie, for raising these topics. Extremely useful and interesting information, and I'm sure we'll also get back to it. Next speaker is Ingrid, please.
Yes, thank you. There are some very interesting political implications of this, and my contribution is essentially a few remarks on what to look at and a few of the trends that might be particularly relevant in, say, the next 18 months or up to the planned presidential elections for 2024. At a domestic level, it's, as Ika said in the keynote, it's obvious that the oil embargo and the price cap on Russian oil will hit revenue. And this comes after a period in this year of first unprecedentedly high regional and federal tax revenue, and then as a very sudden turnaround. So it's coming at a point where the options suddenly change for government at all levels. At the same time, you have the effects of mobilization, especially on the available workforce. And then there is the one of the most important effects on the domestic economy in Russia of sanctions is on logistics and transports, domestic transports in of course, what is, as we know, a very big country. This has, of course, hit industrial centers and internal coordination in the economy very hard. And of course, major industries are also directly hit by the sanctions. Russia's industries have been very dependent on imported components, as we have heard. So this lack of input will be expected, or is already hitting, from various estimates, around 60% of Russia's value chains, which is that's very much. So what are we seeing, and what will we need to look out for? Also, as researchers, to try to understand events as they unfold, given that we have less statistics, less of the hard informations. Well, we are seeing a degradation of quality. This affects implements, machine tools, industries, entire industries. Shabby and outdated software is a part of this picture. And as we all know, the technological advance, the forefront of the digital infrastructure for our everyday lives is moving very fast. So when Russia does not have access to this is rapidly becoming a major sort of source of degradation in the economy. We might see one of the trends that could be likely to emerge is a cruder economy, increased reliance on the resource industries, not because the resource industries themselves necessarily will grow, but because other industries will not grow. So that's one trend that is likely to emerge, in my opinion. That's an opinion, so it's open for discussion. This, of course, creates a demand for policy, a demand for government, and then, of course, there is the question of what is the quality of Russia's bureaucracy at this point. That's a major issue, because what can a bureaucracy do in a personalist autocratic regime? There is very little room for, well, there isn't room for initiative from below unless it already fits with policy priorities. And the policy priorities are on defense industries, for example, but not necessarily on policies that would turn the industries, for example, resources or defense, into a locomotive for growth. We are not, that's not on the agenda. So in terms of domestic politics, we already have regional discrepancies and major differences among regions, and that is likely to emerge as a major challenge for government. I'll leave it there for the domestic, and just internationally, very quickly, just to draw a picture here. Well, sanctions evasion, there is a question whether it's actually possible to establish sanctions evasion chains, because you would need China to get involved to actually have the quantity that you would need to rely on as Russia. I mean, it's not more than 2% of the global economy, but that's still quite a big country. So the cost of sanctions evasion will eat into margins. The turn to Asia, as we have seen, is becoming a dependence on China on a much larger scale than has been the case up until now. Now, in this context, it is important to remember that Russia's appeal in the global south is considerable. And especially if we see a global economy that is increasingly also becoming regionalized with tendencies toward fragmentation of global trade, for example. So the appeal in the global south is considerable, but Russia's trade with the global south is not substantial. Of course, that means that there is potential there, but well, it's an open question. Will Russia be able to capitalize on that? I'm not so sure, but what we'll see. The existing Russian trade with countries outside, say, major trading partners in Asia and Europe, is very much niche trading, and of course agriculture as also very important. So in terms of Russia's global power projection, I think we will see an increasing reliance on China also there. And that's not going to be an easy relationship to handle politically. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, also for raising a number of very important issues, including the cooperation and involvement of Russia with the Global South. Now I think we can get to our Q&A internally here. And probably first, if any of the speakers have questions to some of the panelists. You can start thinking of them, but then I'll just take the floor and ask several questions so that we can start our discussion going in several directions. Well, for the first question, I would address to Ika and then also to other speakers. Ika, your institute, BOFIT, is known not only for your research on Russia, but also on China. So I'm quite curious if you could share with us your opinion about to what extent, for example, China could replace some of the missing components and parts, because that's on the one hand it's expectation in Russia, well, that basically this turn to Asia could compensate and maybe replace and basically mitigate some of the negative consequences. At the same time, as you clearly presented, this has not happened yet. So if you could just look also a bit into the future. And also, Arna, if you could also maybe, you have been also working on India and still work on it. And we know that Russia is also developing its relationship with India at a scale maybe not the same as with China, but still. So if you could also comment with respect to the technological development and what this cooperation could give when we have this isolation with respect to the West. So, Ika, please.
Thank you. That's a very, very good question, billion ruble question if you want. I think over time, China will, or Chinese companies will be able to replace some of the things that Russia is now unable to get from the West, sort of geopolitically speaking. At the same time, all of these adjustments, they take time and they can actually be fairly difficult, just in terms of technology. Then, in the most high-end goods, sort of high-tech goods, China is still unable to actually produce, say, microchips in the same way Taiwan or South Korea do. So this is something that Russia will not get from China. And then I do think, and I think this comes out also when one looks what happened after 2014, that the longer the sanctions are in place, the bigger is the sort of Russia's distance from the technological frontier will grow only longer. So it will become more and more backward in that sense. Now, it doesn't mean that Russia or Russia's economy will collapse. I mean, if one looks at Iran, what has happened after sanctions, Iran, I mean, is still there. Iranian economy is, sometimes it is growing, sometimes it's contracting. It has become less technologically advanced, but it can still produce drones that are now used in Ukraine, for example. So, I mean, China will help Russia somewhat, but yeah, as I said, it cannot replace everything that Russia has lost. And furthermore, China is not doing this, or Chinese companies are not doing this out of the sort of goodness of their heart. They want something in return. And for example, we can calculate from Chinese data that China is currently paying for Russian crude oil. The unit price is 16–17% lower than crude oil imports from other countries. And before the war, there was no discount. So clearly, Chinese importers of crude oil are taking advantage of the situation. And I would presume that this similar attitude sort of prevails also in exporting industries. And we have some reports from Russian media that, for example, the Chinese microchips that have been imported into Russia, the share of defective chips has increased drastically after the war, basically because Russians have very other alternatives at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Ika. Arne?
Yes, very important and kind of difficult question. I think, of course, China's industrial capacity has increased tremendously. If you look at the trade between China and Russia, its growth has been incredible over the last 2 decades. And China is developing rapidly, so their capacity will increase over time. So their possibility for substitutability depends, in a way, also on the time frame. India is, of course, at a different step in development. They have selectively high competency in ICT and pharmaceuticals, for example. So they have some strong sectors, but they are a much poorer country. I think so that will take time. I think both countries are, of course, affected by this wish to have a multipolar world order, also in the economic field, and that is also why India is more hesitant in a sense with respect to sanctions. So I'm kind of old-fashioned in the sense that I still believe we have to defend the multilateral system. So we have to handle trade and technology within the international frameworks existing, if they can still be used. So, for example, on trade, we have to do sanctions justified by the security clause of the WTO, even if the kind of broadness of jurisdiction is limited there. So we have to kind of stick to that. In the technology field, we have the TRIPS agreement, and now the CHIPS Act in the USA, where USA kind of tends to prohibit exports of certain types of chips. You have kind of 5 big countries making chips, and they are trading different types of chips. So this is a kind of game changer, possibly, and important. So, but my view is that we need international jurisdiction and cooperation, and Norway, as a small country, certainly does. So you have to kind of practice this, and for example, this securitization of international trade and economics that Trump introduced, supported by his prophet Navarro, that you would justify all kinds of measures by security. There is a kind of weird case now about the steel and aluminum tariffs of Trump, where many countries complained in the WTO, including Norway, and also the EU, but they had a steel deal a year ago. So Norway is complaining against the USA together with Russia, India, China, etc. So, and the case is pending, and the panel report is awaited in the last quarter of this year. Yeah, so this is a kind of a weird example, but I think the morale is that we have to kind of go for international cooperation. We have to do sanctions, but we have to legitimate them in the with the relevant clauses internationally.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Now I'd like to return to the domestic politics in Russia, and my question to Ingrid. Ingrid, if you could comment on the the effects of the inflationary pressures and how they could affect, maybe already affecting the issues related to income inequality and the situation in different parts of Russia in terms of like the regional for example, income revenue and well, other things that relate to the basically well, income of the population there?
Well, of course, part of the very important background here is, as you mentioned or started your introduction, is that the situation now comes at the end not of several years of prosperous growth, but of several years of decline in real incomes. So from what I remember, there's only been a few quarters with positive growth in real incomes over the last few years, but the main picture is a decline of real incomes since 2014. So people's savings, especially in the lower income brackets, have already been eroded. So this means that there's not a lot of flexibility. When meeting inflations, you know, people tend to eat into their savings and spend their savings first. But when there are no savings to spend, that's a problem. And from various estimates, you have around a quarter of the population with no savings, or who are below or just above the poverty line. So of course, inflation has an impact directly on people's diets. You know, reducing meat consumption, saving up for buckwheat, just simple things like that. And that's what has been happening to a large extent. In regional terms, of course, you have very poor regions where this is the general picture, and then you have regions like, for example, Moscow, or oil-producing regions, St. Petersburg also, because many of the major companies, they're taxed where their headquarters are. So this means that Moscow and to a considerable extent also St. Petersburg have good tax revenues compared with many other regions. So yes, inflation has had that effect. To some extent, of course, the better off in middle income brackets spent the beginning of the first few weeks after the war to, for example, use their savings to buy new technology or implements in anticipation of inflation and of goods being taken off the market. So it's a bit difficult to know, you know, what the effects of that will be further on. But yes, inflation is a thing, and also we have to keep in mind as well the sort of the legacy of the years from 2014 and to 2022, because one of the issues there is that the policies of import substitution, also in food and agriculture, had created internal, well, not necessarily formally monopolies, but there were fewer sources for example, different types of products. So there was the effect of increasing prices, and that was particularly the case in the food industries in Russia. Of course, Russia is an important agricultural country with a fairly well managed, at least relatively in Russian terms, food industry. But of course there are bottlenecks, and especially in transport, logistics, cooling in particular. But one of the effects of import substitution policies and of the policy changes from 2014 has been to add on to prices. So, and that of course also explains why especially the poorer income segments are not all that well off, or were not well off in February.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid. This is excellent that you touched upon the issue of import substitution policies, and I'm sure we'll also come back to them. I have a question also to Cecilia. So you already mentioned this issue of challenges related to public expenditure. What do you expect of the basically public debt in Russia within the next few years, coupled, of course, with the issues of contracting GDP growth and all other issues that we just mentioned?
Well, it's dependent upon people actually being willing to borrow Russian money, which could be an issue nowadays. But of course, if the risk premium is high enough, they will. Consequently, if they are going to keep the expenditures up, which I assume they will, the debt will be increasing. And also the payments for the debts. This doesn't, like Russia has actually quite low public debt compared to many other countries. Which makes up, well, it's not a huge crisis that Russia gets more debt, but it adds up to the problem that they will spend more money on defense, and they will spend more money on paying for debt. And in addition, they need to spend more money on infrastructure in order to reroute the whole exports via the eastern part of Russia, and it's not set up for exporting that much that direction. So they need to put a lot of money into some set programs, and that affects the possibility of other public goods that they normally offer, which could affect the average Russian in further details. So that's kind of the problem here.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia. I think now is the time to open the floor for questions to the audience. I would ask you to introduce yourself, say where you work, and then basically I think the best if we collect 3 questions, and also please state to whom you address your questions. Maybe to all panelists or just to some of them. I see a hand here. David. Just a second. Please use the microphone.
I'm David Tarr. So to follow up on Cecilia's last point, I'd like to ask both Ika and Cecilia, is there any evidence that the Central Bank of Russia is financing this debt? Or you were mentioning that, in your answer, it sounded as if this is being purchased by the private sector. But the question is, as you mentioned, there's a risk that it'll be difficult, or at least the risk premium will go up to finance it. But the question is the central bank stepping in and therefore contributing to inflation more significantly.
I didn't really hear the last part of the sentence.
Is the central bank financing the debt and therefore contributing to inflation more significantly?
The central bank.
Oh.
Thank you, David. Let's take 2 more questions. I see here.
Sorry, thank you. My name is Benedicte Bull. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oslo, Center for Development and the Environment. Thank you for a great, really informative panel. 2 brief questions. One is if any of you have looked at the real political implications of the hardships that Russia is facing economically, if there's any evidence of how that leads to any changes in public attitudes towards the government or towards what's going on. And my second question is, if there's, I'm sure this is really difficult to find evidence of, but if anyone has looked at kind of how the economic impact of the sanctions leads to different strategies by Russian general people or companies, how are they surviving? What kind of strategies do they apply? We've seen in many other sanctioned countries that both companies and individuals turn to more illegal activities, informal activities. Do we have any evidence of these kind of processes going on in Russia at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can take it from here. Yeah, so Arne, please. Yeah.
Yeah, a brief comment on even if I'm not a political scientist, a brief comment on the political impact of sanctions. We have a joint project called Euroshocks about all the international shocks hitting European integration, and colleagues at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, they have done some work on the political impact of sanctions against Russia in 2014. They scanned all the web pages of Russia to get detailed election results and checked if the exposure to sanctions affected outcomes. And they found that sanctions strengthened Putin at the expense of the Communist Party. So it's ambiguous how sanctions turn out to affect the domestic political audience, although it's, of course, very difficult to measure the attitudes in a repressive regime where people cannot speak too loudly.
Thank you. Mika, would you like to?
Thank you. Well, on the central bank financing, so far, if you look at the balance sheet, there's no such financing of government deficit. As Roman said, basically, and Cecilia, they have been able to finance the deficit so far by drawing down the National Welfare Fund. And then, of course, much of the Russian banking sector was actually in pretty good shape coming into the crisis. And so presumably, at some point, if needed, then the banks would be buying government bonds. Of course, the liquidity or with normal liquidity provisions by central bank. Then on the political attitudes caused by the hardship, actually, if you look at say Central Bank of Russia, every month they do a poll on consumer confidence. When the war broke out, there was a big drop in consumer confidence, but when the immediate effects on ordinary Russians were limited to the 10% increase in price level, people sort of assumed that, okay, this was it, and then things returned to, not to normal, but sort of as close to normal as could be, and consumer confidence recovered basically to pre-war levels. But then there was even a bigger drop in October after the September mobilization. So whenever things affect directly households, there's an effect. There's a clear effect. But the sort of more abstract notions of or the links between sanctions and then the living standards of ordinary Russians are perhaps too sort of diffuse and opaque for most people to grasp anyway.
Mm-hmm. Ingrid?
Yes, just a couple of comments because I can't add all that much to any evidence, but one of the political implications, but there's a sort of a link here between the mechanisms that are already in place to maintain the population in the autocratic scheme of things in a passive role. And that is, of course, that hardships imposed from outside, like through sanctions, they can feed into this besieged fortress mentality. And thereby strengthen, for example, Putin's popularity. At the same time, though, the sanctions and also the inflationary pressures, they are also they're hitting very differently across Russia, and what to watch out for, sort of looking into the future. One of the things that's worth watching is the extent to which poverty levels and pressure on regional budgets hit the same regions that are also contributing a lot to the actual war through mobilization and through contract soldiers, because to a considerable extent from what we know, and we don't know all about this, is that poverty is in itself a recruitment factor to the military. So when the same regions are hit both in terms of the economic effects of the war and the actual war contribution to the war, that's worth watching. So the poorer regions with more mobilized personnel, with more soldiers returning in coffins that are at the same time hit through regional budgets. But it's too early to point more specifically at evidence of this happening, at least from what I know.
I think Ika responded David's question very well. I haven't seen any how they adapt within the grey economy or trying to avoid the sanctions. But I read in this questionnaire that the central bank performs how different companies in the East have tried to adapt to the sanctions. And it seems like the biggest problem is transporting the product outside of the country. So, for example, one lumber producer now had to try to use the river to transport the lumber there, which they hadn't done for quite a few decades. So, and then they try to send products to Africa, but it takes time. They try to find new markets, a new way of getting paid to avoid SWIFT sanctions, and but it takes time, so it seems like most of them are hit quite severely, actually.
Mm-hmm. And are there any signs that this evasion of sanctions is also taking place within the Eurasian Economic Union, where there are several members that basically share more or less the same, well, basically they apply the same, standards, so that, for example, they could be used for logistics or transportation. Yeah. That's also a question to Ika after that, yeah? If there any,
you want to go first?
I want to go first. No, I don't know how it hits there. I just know that there have been troubles by transporting across the borders. It's not the sufficient capacity. So they had to increase the roads and reopen bridges that had been closed earlier in order to transport. So there's some transport issues in the eastern part. But how it actually affects the production concretely, I don't know.
Yeah, on that, this is the more general question of how difficult it is actually to say how much there is of sanctions avoidance. For example, Finnish exports to Kazakhstan have doubled, of course, from fairly low level. But if you look at then the production, so the product categories, even at very granular level, we cannot say if this is sanctions avoidance or not. I mean, it could be partly, but partly it is, as was mentioned, just the logistics are now, if I wanted to ship something completely legal to Russia, it actually would be very difficult because there are no trains anymore. There are no flights. Basically, there are no ships, and the trucks are very few and far between. And I think that's also at least partially the reason why Turkish exports to Russia have really exploded in recent months, that a lot of European, especially European companies, are actually routing their also legal goods via Turkey. So if you look at exports to Turkey, in certain categories from certain European EU countries, they have really exploded. But then some of it seems to be, as far as we can tell from sort of statistics, completely legal. But I mean, they cannot ship those goods in any other way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think when this war is over, we have to analyze and discuss how smart are the smart sanctions. Because they can be smart, for example, in the field of finance. So you can have targeted sanctions, and technology could also motivate targeted sanctions. But on the other hand, very specific sanctions on persons and firms become very complex. So from an implementation view, broad sanctions forbidding trade, etc., could be easier to handle. So this is, of course, also a matter of political economy, because you have to make tough compromises to agree on the sanction, and then some of the smartness is actually the political smartness, not necessarily related to the efficiency as such. So yeah, so this is a kind of broad issue about sanctions, which should be kind of examined in the ex post after this conflict.
Thank you, Arne. Let's take some more questions. And I should say I'm sorry that maybe I will not see all the hands because of very strong lights here, but our communications will help us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ramadan from the Egyptian embassy here in Oslo. Just on the sanctions, I probably missed also that, so forgive me if that has been said by the speakers. I haven't heard what's the purpose of the sanctions exactly. Is it to force Russia to withdraw from Ukraine? Is it to weaken Russian economy? What is exactly the purpose of the sanctions? And two, the effect of the sanctions on non-European countries, especially countries in the third world who have been suffering from the effect of these sanctions. I will not talk about the effects of the sanctions on European countries, especially those imposing the sanctions, that for them to discuss. But on other countries who have nothing to do with this war, have been dramatically affected by the food crisis and the oil prices. Thank you very much.
Jack, there's a question here.
Thank you. Thank you. Jack Sharples, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Having listened to all of your presentations and comments, one thing sort of strikes me, and I take reference as well to Ika's projections for GDP decline in 2022 and 2023. It seems that what we are looking at is not a short-term collapse of the Russian economy, but rather a long-term degradation, and that the impact of this will primarily be felt on the mass of the Russian population as expressed through declining living standards. But in the context of an authoritarian regime where you can't easily go out and protest against these, and it's not very easy, let's say, to use the democratic process to change the government and change course, would it be fair to say then we are in this for the long haul, that this could be a new situation of zastoy, stagnation in Russia for a more long-term period? And if not, then why not? Thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Axel Noon and I'm from the Irish Embassy. My question relates to the previous question. Actually, I'm interested in the time frame here. Economically speaking, could you perhaps share some thoughts on when this might come to a head for the regime? That is, when, if ever, will this become unsustainable? Thank you.
Right, thank you. Who would like to be the first?
Well, I can start. Yep. Purpose of the sanctions, well, I guess ultimately we want to have an end to the war. And currently the end of the war means that Russia stops fighting and withdraws from Ukraine. Sanctions can help, but as I said in my opening remarks, sanctions are not the only tool. Currently sanctions, I think the main purposes are two. First, to limit the amount of money available for fighting. And then second, to limit the capability of Russian economy to replace the military equipment that it is losing in Ukraine. I don't think, and I'm not speaking to sort of in behalf of anybody, but at least I didn't expect sanctions to have an effect that would lead to political uprising in Russia. I think that's completely, or if anybody had those kind of thoughts, they were completely unreasonable. Perhaps at some point there will be some split within the elites, but even that, it's really sort of somewhere further down the road. And then my own, and again, I stress this is my own sort of thinking and speculation, is that yes, we are in this indeed for a long haul. I think at least under the current regime, for example, the companies that have left Russia and stopped doing business in Russia, they will not go back. I mean, perhaps if there is a change in regime, they might reconsider. But I have a very hard time in imagining a CEO going to his or her board and telling that they have this great investment opportunity in Russia. And this relates then to the question of time frame. Unfortunately, it seems that the fighting will continue at least for some time. I mean, perhaps in 23 we will see end. I mean, hopefully, but who knows? But as I said, I do believe that sanctions will remain in place for quite some time. Then one further point, the effect of sanctions on third countries. Food prices and oil prices, I don't see any connection to sanctions. I see connection to war. And on oil prices, sanctions will kick in only in the beginning of December. So then we will see what the effect is. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe Ingrid, maybe you.
Yes, just on the effect of sanctions on third countries, I can't but second Ikke's comments there. War itself is what has affected food prices in particular and oil prices. And as to food prices, for example, grains, Russia introduced restrictions on grains exports. As part of its invasion, or as a sort of supporting the invasion, at least arguably, that's the connection there. And also taking Ukrainian grain off the market. Now, I don't know the numbers for Egypt, but for many other countries in North and Eastern Africa, Ukraine has also been a very substantial source of grain. So yes, and fertilizer, for example, not affected by sanctions. Yes, that's on that. But yes, as to the question when the whole situation will become politically unsustainable for the regime in Russia. Well, that's the tricky question, isn't it? Because this is long-term developments, and there is. It doesn't look as if there is a sort of a breaking point economically. So how to see this in terms of political effects? My guess is as good as any's. My guess is that this is with this gradual degradation, possibly increased repression, because what else can you do when there are so few instruments to use in the economy to keep the population happy? Repression is probably going to be part of the answer there, and then, well, I would expect it to be stable until it then suddenly isn't any longer. Because you have, it's an easy way of answering the question, but you have this gradual undermining of the instruments of stability, and then at some point they are actually no longer there, and then it is a question of what will the population do. The population, as we know it, is apolitical, not going to start any major protests as far as we know. You will have regional incidents, and then at some point the pressure might start to build up. But yeah, saying these things is always very risky because we don't know really. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a small point on the sort of political uncertainty and repression in the new fiscal plan that Cecilia mentioned as well. up to 25, the spending on internal security or internal repression, however you want to call it, is set to increase. In comparison to 21, in 23 it should be roughly 90% higher, and it will remain there at this high level until 25, whereas the defense spending or the sort of explicit defense spending is set to decline after 23, and this increase is actually roughly 1% of GDP. So clearly the regime is sort of planning to spend much more money on making sure that things are kept under control domestically.
A comment on that last point first. Some of the internal security forces have actually been used in Ukraine, so it might not only be internally the Russia we know it, but also the so-called annexed parts of Russia that they're using internal forces there. So actually internal security spending might be just related to the war as well. So actually when I'm talking doubling defense expenditures, that includes the internal security budgets as well. When it comes to the time frame, sanctions or not, I don't think Europe will ever go back to being that dependent upon Russian energy once again. It's too dangerous. So whether if we quit the sanctions, we won't go back. So I think that actually the petrol dependence upon Russia, it's gone. I can't see it in any foreseeable future, and that's independent of sanctions.
Thanks, Arne.
Yeah, I think. As stated by others, and I also refer to these other researchers, the domestic political impact of sanctions is kind of ambiguous, and I will not speculate about the rifts in the regime. The sanctions are putting pressure and strain on the regime without an immediate collapse. So that could be said to be in conformity with the kind of objectives. The third I would add is that sanctions is an international protest, and by creating an international alliance against the war. And I would say that's the greatest hope to finish this war soon, is that you have an even stronger international alliance. So China is a key player, so if they kind of become a bit more determined in this field, that could have a big impact. India is also important, so this international perspective is quite important. So we just have to hope this ends as soon as possible, and then that of course, the sanctions is but one of the support tools. So the most important thing happens on the ground, and so far there has been no climate for talk about compromises, but of course there are options if the situation changes. So yes.
Thank you, Arne.
As I just final comment, I committed a chapter called Russia in World Trade in an international textbook. We sent the manuscript to Palgrave in February. 15th February. Yeah, so I had to add in the final proofreading that it was up to date until the pre-war. So it's still true what's in there. But of course, this says that Russia is a small trader. It's Germany is 4 times larger in terms of the trade volume. But of course, Russia is large on commodities. It's 12% of natural resource revenues in the world. And it's not only oil and gas, it's a lot of metals and other things, nuclear fuel, whatever. So Russia is important, so they will play an important role as a commodity supplier, even with changed gas and energy perspective.
Right. Well, we are actually coming to the end of our panel. I still have one question, which I think is important to touch upon. And that was already raised by Ingrid. So it's the issue of import substitution policies. We know that Russia introduced them in response to the sanctions of 2014. So my question is then about the overall Russian purely domestic capacity in terms of production, in terms of also internal trade, and also what is its capacity in terms of import substitution policies. We know that there were some success stories before the war started, and many also, failed industries that didn't really succeed in import substitution. So what's happening to this now? And where do you see, I mean, is there any capacity in terms of Russian domestic production to cope with the impact of the sanctions? Arne?
Well, I think Russia has been desperately seeking for diversification, afraid of having the Dutch disease and resource curse, etc. And so the data show that the food sector is the one that has strongly expanded over the last decade, especially. So exports and production of food has expanded. A kind of paradoxical thing in this situation is that they also expanding the seafood sector, and they are trading feedstuff with Norway still, and they've prohibited, of course, Norwegian exports to one of the largest markets in 2014. When you traveled in Russia in 2013-14, you could have salmon for breakfast. But that was end of story, of course, in 2014. So perhaps we have a new perspective now on this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ika, would you like?
Well, very little. I mean, yes, as Arne mentioned, I think food industry is one area where they actually starting already from 2012, and the original government policies were adopted. That's an area where they have succeeded. Not in all sectors of food industry. I think, and this of course comes out, for example, in last year's government report on import substitution policies, that almost all of the sort of sectoral policies and targets that were set in 2014 or after 2014, they have failed. So companies have not been able to, or sectors have not been able to meet those very ambitious targets, and there has not really been a sort of technological upgrade of sectors and production. Of course, now they have to try even harder, but of course, and then the external situation is that much more difficult. So I'm not very optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Cecilia?
I can only speak about the Russian defense industry. They were cut off from Western components since 2014, and they had already started this ambitious armament program back in 2011. And with the ambition becoming self-sufficient on arms, and in some parts they have increased. They don't. Earlier they used to import some arms. Now they don't anymore, but they're still dependent upon some components, which they haven't really succeeded on. Of course, Ukraine didn't want to export their engines for the armament systems after they invaded and annexed Crimea. They have later on imported this from China. So it's been some development, but they haven't completely succeeded. Yeah.
And Ingrid?
Yeah, if I can add anything, it's a further nuance. For example, the success, relative and considerable success in the food industries. It's very significant that the approach to input substitution was to substitute sort of end products, and at least in many industries, and not attracting parts of value chains. So not working with the economy that was already integrated into global value chains, but trying to move end products production into Russia. For example, in the food industry, it's or agriculture and then food industry is really dependent on seeds and feedstocks coming from Europe, particularly from France and Netherlands. So the success is tempered. It's still limited, even though in food and agriculture it's been considerable. And I think that's indicative of the sort of the policy challenge of doing something like that to a major economy in the current or in 2014 in the global economy that was then, and I think the problem is only even bigger now because you can do some things when you have peace and potential for growth, but now that you don't really have that, and it's difficult to attract investment, what can you do with the policy of import substitution? I think that's sort of a major problem just right there.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for your remark. And also thank you very much to all other panelists. I wish we could have more time to keep this great discussion going. I think we had really excellent contributions and excellent panelists. But in the interest of time, we have to stop now. But let me just thank you once again for your contributions. And let's give them a round of applause. Yeah? Tuned for the second panel, which will be about on the energy sector developments and climate change in Russia. That we will start at 11 o'clock. And now you could please feel free to enjoy your coffee break.
Can we try to find our seats now, please? Start in 2 minutes. Du fikk med deg den, Ari?
Okay. Okay, can you please find your seats so we can start the second panel of this year's Russia conference. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we all know and we have heard again today that energy is very much a part of the Russian economy, not the big news for anybody here. It's important for Russian political power. At the same time, development in the Russian energy sectors is important for the global climate. And Russia, as you would know, is among the biggest emitters of climate gas in the world. In this session, we are discussing issues both directly on what is happening in the energy sector and also the link to climate, related but also separate issues. We have collected a fine panel of people who have been involved in studies of these topics for a long time. Jack Sharples from Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. David Tarr, consultant to the World Bank, where he has also had several senior positions. Research professor Anna Korpo from the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. And Tatiana Mitrova, who is now with the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy. I think we will start with you, Jack. We have talked already about exports to some extent, but looking at this now also a little bit from the market side, is there any circumstances where you could think there will be a role for Russian gas in Europe in the years to come?
Well, I think to answer that question, we need to understand where we are today, how we got to this situation, and then to extrapolate forward. So in terms of the flow of Russian pipeline gas to Europe, I would say that the decline in that flow rather puts me in mind of Fiesta, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, where one of the characters is asked, "So how did you go bankrupt?" And he responds, "Gradually, then suddenly." And that is really what has happened with Russian gas flows to Europe over the last 18 months. In proportional terms, in October, let's take October as a month. It's the month for which we have the most recent full month data. Between 2017 and 2020, in the month of October, Russia provided around 36% of total European gas supply. In 2021, that had fallen to 27%. Last month, it was 6%. So we have seen a very sharp decline in relative terms. In absolute terms, given our location for this conference today, I can put it in a Norwegian context. The Capacity for Norwegian pipeline gas deliveries to Europe, if we include the UK in this, is about 350 million cubic meters per day. Now, in the fourth quarter of last year, that was also roughly the average that we were getting from Russia. Right now, since the beginning of October, we're getting about 60 to 65 million cubic meters per day. So we have seen an absolutely huge decline. Now, the question is, how did that decline unfold? In 2021, it began with Gazprom actually selling less into the spot market through its own electronic sales platform. They ceased doing that entirely in October last year, so well before the invasion. Then in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, we had this demand for payment in rubles as opposed to euros and dollars, and those European companies with long-term contracts that refused had their supplies cut off. We also saw Gazprom abandon its downstream trading subsidiaries in Europe, most notably Gazprom Germania, which is now trading under the name Safe Energy for Europe in Germany. We've also seen Russian sanctions against the Yamal Europe pipeline that passes through Poland, so that flow is stopped. Throughout the summer, we saw, let's call them maintenance issues with turbines connected to the Nord Stream pipeline, and then the mysterious explosions more recently. And so if we take all of this together and the fact that European companies are now, by and large, unwilling to extend any long-term contracts they have with Gazprom when they expire, we can take all of those factors together and say, I do not foresee those factors changing at any time in the near future. Therefore, I do not see a recovery in the flow of pipeline gas from Russia to Europe. Instead, all of Europe's effort now is in finding alternatives. So to answer your question,
well,
I don't
sort of
yeah.
It didn't give me not much in terms of yes, volumes from Russia. But Tatjana, this development in the gas export, but also in oil exports we heard about earlier, curtailing energy exports. What does it mean internally? I mean, what you see, what could be the impact internally in the Russian oil and gas sector? What is the sort of the balance of power between the players in the industry?
Well, first of all, I would say that these are two different stories, oil industry and gas industry. Basically, these are two different stories also in terms of exports and volumes and the scale of reduction. So indeed, gas exports to Europe, they've dropped down by 78% year on year if you compare to October or November last year. So that's a huge decline, though there are still LNG exports ongoing, basically at the same scale, and exports to China are growing. Slowly, but they are building up. Gazprom is still increasing capacity of Power of Siberia, which was built back in 2019, but still hasn't reached its projected capacity yet. All in all, the reduction of Russian gas production today is about 38 to 40%. That's a lot. I mean, there was always this summer swing in gas production. Yeah, so seasonality in winter, Russia was producing more gas, in summer it was producing less. But what we are observing right now, it's really extraordinary. And that means that the gas industry is facing really big problems. All the underground storages in Russia are full. Yeah, it means that there will be far less or basically zero new drilling for gas. Yeah, and probably some of the wells drilled will have to be stopped. It has happened already once. Back in 2011, 2012, remember when there was gas crisis in Europe, when the demand fell down considerably and Gazprom had to reduce its supplies to Europe. And by that time, I think Miller was saying that this underutilized capacity of Gazprom is like 150 billion cubic meters. So we are going back to that point. Why I'm referring to this historical experience? Because Russia had already faced such a challenge to the need to dramatically reduce gas output, and it did it. Yes, it came at a price. Yes, probably some of the reserves were lost, some of the gas fields were flooded, yeah, in an irreversible way. But basically, when you have such an abundant gas resources, I would say, who cares? So it is the price that the government was ready to sacrifice in favor of geopolitical decisions. Yeah. The domestic demand is completely covered with gas production. So basically, there is no real problem for the economy except for the loss of the gas export revenues, which were considerable, but absolutely negligible compared to the oil revenues. So it is also an important point that gas was providing probably 10% of oil compared to oil revenues of the budget. Gas export, yeah, I'm talking about export specifically. And moreover, the government has already declared they are preparing now new taxes, tax increases on mineral extraction tax and profit tax and everything. So they are planning to increase this tax pressure on the oil and gas industry, which will be primarily on the domestic consumers, because they are now the major consumers of the Russian gas. So all in all, I would say it's unpleasant for the industry, but it's not a catastrophe. With the oil industry, the situation is different because basically there was no decline in exports. You won't believe, but Russia is now exporting as much oil as before COVID. Yeah, as before the OPEC Plus decision to cut output and exports. So, of course, there will be this embargo coming into force in December. And of course, there will be decline in Russian exports inevitably. But basically, this will, I assume, be more related to the need to change logistics, yeah? To resend some of the flows rather than a complete stop of these exports. And basically, Russia is exporting 7 million barrels per day. European market, with this embargo, it will lose from 1.5 up to 2 million barrels per day. Yeah, that's felt, yeah, that's a lot. It's 25 to maybe 30% of oil exports. But actually, during COVID, Russia has lost 20%, and it has survived. And remember, by that time, prices were much lower than now. So again, unpleasant, but not catastrophic. And when we are talking about these embargo and oil price cap, again, there is still a lot of uncertainty how exactly this mechanism will be introduced, how it will be enforced. Because looking at the Iranian example, yeah, you can see that there are lots of these gray bypasses and gray schemes how to transport this oil without transponders and transship it during the night in the open sea somewhere and put like 10 intermediaries hiding the routes of the oil, and all the blending schemes which are already quite actively utilized. So if there is no very strict implementation mechanism, then actually it will look like this share of oil going to unknown direction. It will simply increase dramatically to the level of, I don't know, 1.5, 2 million barrels per day, yeah, ending up somewhere probably in the Middle East, in India, being processed, and then as processed product sent to Europe again. Yeah, so this is a possibility which will not actually help to reduce oil revenues or to change something in the military front. And actually, even if the oil price cap is implemented very strictly, I'm trying to show that it's not actually solving the key problem. The oil and gas revenues, they are still at rather high level. Right now, in the latest figures we have for October, actually oil and gas revenues of the Russian budget are slightly above the same level of 2021. So they went down compared to enormous spikes which were seen in April and in March, when they were like going through the roof because of very high prices. But they are still slightly above the level of 2021. So when we are talking about the sanctions, embargoes, and collapse in Russian oil and gas revenues, it hasn't happened yet. Most likely it will gradually increase, and the volumes will go down. The prices will remain rather high for a period of time because the global market is very tight. So it will take at least several more years before the supply-demand balance will be restored globally. OPEC is definitely supporting Russia. You can see it from all the decisions and all the communications. And the oil price cap, it is something that makes OPEC extremely worried. They don't want to see it as a concept, because they understand that it can be applied to any of the OPEC members at a certain point. So OPEC will play together with Russia in this game. And basically, that is the picture. On the external side, domestically, as you can imagine, as the rent revenues start to shrink, the battle to have access to these revenues is increasing. And we can see already all these battles between the domestic elites. They came out from under the carpet to this scene already. And of course, some sort of redivision of the market is already occurring. And I would expect much more to come with, first of all, increased nationalization. De facto nationalization, a much stronger role of the state in any decision-making in the oil and gas industry. The whole Russian economy is becoming much more of mobilization economy, acting under direct state leadership rather than business decisions and commercial rationale. State-controlled companies, first of all, Rosneft, are obviously increasing their influence, and here I'm really quite skeptical about the future of Lukoil, for example. So I assume that in a year or two we can see some sort of changed, some mergers and acquisitions, probably quite unfriendly, taking place. And similarly in the gas industry, I'm not sure that Gazprom will remain as the national champion in the longer future, because it has failed with all of its export obligations, and Russia will need a company representing it internationally, at least in Asia. So there could be some shift of power, there could new players evolve, there could be some shift of power between Gazprom, Novatek, Rosneft. So I think it is the time of turbulence when the major stakeholders will fight in order to have control over the export flows. I'll stop on that.
Thank you. Sort of quite interesting outlook. We don't talk so often about coal, but Russia is also a big producer and exporter of coal. And Anna, you have worked on the Russian coal sector. What is the impact of the sanctions that have already been introduced on Russian coal exports?
Well,
can sort of this turn to the east replace lost European demand, for instance?
That's a good question. First, I should say, kind of to add what Ariel said first, that it's quite obvious that we don't hear so much about coal. Because if you compare Russian coal sector to the gas and oil sectors, it only provides about 1% of Russian GDP. So it's not, by kind of putting sanctions on the coal sector, you are not going to stop a great sort of revenue streams to Putin's coffers. But here our title of the panel was also climate and decarbonization. And from that point of view, of course, coal is very significant. In Russia, using coal, it accounts for about 22% of greenhouse gas emissions. And Russia's quite massive exports of coal, they will roughly produce about the same amount of greenhouse gases as Russia produces domestically, about 1/3 of that Russia produces domestically when they get consumed elsewhere. So it makes sense to talk about coal, even though we're not talking about the same kind of economic impact internally. So if we think about the sanctions on the coal sector, what I call the war gap, so the amount of demand for coal that was there for 2021, looking at still the Russian statistics which used to be available, which are then kind of vanishing as a result of the EU and other Western countries' sanctions, is about 41%. That's quite a big amount of coal, and 23% of that is EU, and then there's Japan, UK, also Ukraine used to import quite a lot of Russian coal, and some other countries like Norway and Switzerland. But those big ones which continue to buy Russian coal happily will be China, almost as large as the EU, but also Turkey. There's been quite a lot of talk about India and Indian demand, but that's fairly small, only 2.8% it was in 2021. Now, before talking about coal demand this year, we should say that the EU sanctions, which are the most significant ones on coal, they only kicked in in August this year. And that means that most of this year has been more or less normal demand for coal from the EU. We only really saw a decline towards August. So in a way, there was a lot of talk, this kind of, we put embargo on Russian coal, but the development of sort of imports of coal to the EU, they didn't really take effect very early. In Japan and, for instance, Taiwan, it started declining much faster, even though, for instance, Taiwan has not imposed sanctions officially. So the impact on the coal sector in 2022, it's not going to be very large because by the sanctions and the war are not going to be very large because there's been some extra demand from China and India, especially China. I mean, India's demand, you can double and treble, and it's still fairly small share of what Russia kind of would have to export. So if you look at, there's no official data, as Ika already said, that one has to go to the import statistics. It takes a lot of time, and of course it's not the same kind of data as one would then have if it was consistent from the same source. But there have been some numbers given out. And Minister Noak said that during January, July 2022, the coal exports were down by 8.6% only. That's not very much. But in Kemerovo, the area, Kuzbass area, where about half of Russian coal is produced, the impact was larger, about 15% decline during the first half of 2022. So then let's turn to the question about the turn to the east. Is it possible just to redirect Russian coal exports from Europe to Asia? I already mentioned that there has been more demand from China and India, and without a doubt, Russia is selling coal with 50 to 60% discount in comparison to the global prices at the moment. But that's still profitable. If you look at coal price at the moment, it's about 3 times higher than it was before the war started. So there is kind of space to give a good discount and still make more or less the same money than you used to do before the war. And of course, this attracts buyers from Asia. China didn't do so very differently during the first half of this year, but since the summer, there's been significant additional imports. And Russia did agree with China just before the war, incidentally, to import about 100 megatons more coal over the coming years. So Russia exports about 210 megatons per year, so that's a very significant amount. So perhaps this agreement is kind of kicking in. But then the question is for how long, because China is planning to increase its own coal production by about 300 megatons per year. So that is about import security. China had some very bad experiences with some markets, like political disagreements with Australia on coal imports. So as a result, perhaps that is a development which might also reduce China's kind of expected increased imports of coal from Russia over time. And one point still before I end are the logistical major challenges. That's the main reason why it's hard to see how Russia could actually just redirect the European coal exports to Asia, because most coal is transported by rail in Russia, and the capacity is very limited. From Kuzba's area, which is producing about half of Russian coal, about 53 megatons has been transported by rail for the last 5 years per annum. So that is about 1/4 of Russian coal exports. And if we also may have been heard about transporting coal by boat, but you still have to get it to the ports first. So a lot of the coal, most of the coal is mined inland. So kind of that doesn't solve the problem. Therefore, it doesn't seem very likely that this kind of redirection to the east would be very likely in the near future. There's a plan to increase its capacity, but it hasn't really been happening.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there, thanks.
Yeah, that seems to be what we also talked about earlier. So logistical bottlenecks is a very important factor in prospects for development of the Russian economy. Well, you already sort of touched on climate issues, but I'd like to go a bit further on that with David, because we know that over the last few years and before the war, there was a growing concern in Russia over the imposition of custom tariffs to the EU, designated to penalize CO2-intensive products, the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. David, can you tell us something? What is the state of affairs here? How would such a mechanism work, and what kind of impact could it have on Russia? I'm not only talking about energy products, but also energy-intensive products from Russia.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So my colleagues and I have written a paper, which we could call How to Save the Planet, and we focus a bit on Russia, and including the questions you asked. So we know that several high-income countries are pricing carbon emissions to achieve climate change goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Norway is certainly one of the important countries doing that, as well as the European Union. Soon, the European Union and others will also impose the taxes, as we just heard about, these carbon border adjustment mechanisms to tax the embedded carbon in the imports. Unfortunately, virtually all the estimates suggest that these measures by the rich countries will not avoid a climate catastrophe. Okay, so let me repeat that. These measures will not avoid a climate catastrophe. Why? Well, about 2/3 of the global emissions are in the developing countries plus Russia, where carbon emission regulations are weak. Global emissions goals require reduction of carbon emissions in developing countries. So if we take Russia as an example, the World Bank Higher School of Economics study done about 11 months ago estimates that the CBAM will reduce Russian carbon emissions by 1.6%. On the other hand, if Russia were to impose domestic carbon reduction measures through a cap and trade, it would reduce its carbon emissions by 38%. So 1.6% versus 38% in terms of what we're presently doing or planning to do versus what could happen if we could induce Russia and other countries in the developing world to price their carbon emissions domestically. So the key is getting countries to price their emissions domestically. How to solve the problem, though? How do we get them to do this? We propose a climate club based on the suggestion of Professor William Nordhaus. There are 2 rules for member countries to be in the climate club. First, they must set a minimum carbon price in their home country. And second, they must impose a uniform tariff surcharge on all imports from non-member countries. So the penalty tariff surcharge affects the strategic decision of countries to impose domestic pricing of greenhouse gas emissions. So now, the problem, as Arnie suggested earlier, a lot of us, including myself, value highly the World Trade Organization, and many are, as this idea has not gone very far, because I think people are afraid that it cannot be accommodated within the rules of the World Trade Organization. We propose an approach which we believe can allow a climate club along the lines we suggest to be legal under World Trade Organization rules. A complementary proposal is that rich countries subsidize transformative research to make green energy cost efficient with fossil fuels. It's important for developing countries to have options that are not more expensive than fossil fuels in order to get developing countries to join. So, in summary, what are the key messages? Existing measures by rich countries will not avoid a climate catastrophe, and that includes the C-bomb. We need to induce carbon reduction in developing countries and in Russia, where 2/3 of the emissions originate. A climate club can induce widespread participation in climate reduction. These are what the estimates of modelers have suggested. And a climate club can be WTO compatible. And finally, subsidies for transformative green energy research to make clean energy cost effective would also be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, you're painting sort of a broad picture about the outlook for such tariffs, but I think I'd just like to hear if Anna has a sort of a comment on the present state of climate policy in Russia. Is there anything to report about possibilities of Russia being part of international climate regimes?
It really depends on what you mean by a possibility. I would first maybe comment a little bit on what David says about the CBAM. It's, yeah, surely in Russia, it's not going to reduce Russia's emissions very much, but it might still do something what also a carbon club would do, because it has raised interest into this carbon pricing issue in Russia quite a lot, because the EU was imposing something, not just talking and suggesting. So in a way, there are all sorts of directions of interest there going on. But of course, now the situation is very different, because any kind of climate cooperation isn't really in the books with Russia at the moment. And the question from Russia, from the president's climate advisor, Ruslan Edelgiriv, has been whether there should be cooperation on climate anyway, because it's so important globally. And for instance, now there's been the UN climate conference is still on this week, and Russia has been suggesting that around the conference, I'm not sure if in the negotiations, but around the conference, Russia's been bringing up views that that sanctions on low-carbon technologies should be lifted because the climate issue is so important. They have also been mentioning that the Russian carbon emission reduction credits should be allowed to foreign systems. But the really big question here is why? Because Russia has a lot of something that can be called climate policy on paper, but when it comes to implementation and actually reducing emissions as a result of these policies, this plan for a sort of long-term action to become carbon neutral by 2060 and so forth, all sorts of policies beforehand, there's been actually very few emission reductions achieved, mostly just plans and policies and papers. And as an example, if you look at the current Russian domestic carbon projects, it's in the law, it's been established, but those projects are not established according to international rules. I mean, they are not climate additional. They are not projects which would have not otherwise happened necessarily. That is not insured by the law. So that means that if somebody buys those Russian carbon credits, that might actually increase global emissions, because if those projects would have happened anyway, then they are credited, sold to someone else who then emits, then you actually get more emissions. So all these things, unfortunately, have to be kept in mind when you do climate cooperation with Russia. And now I bring this comment back to what David said. This also applies to any climate club, because if there is no transparency of climate policy and the measures with Russia, which has been a problem all along these decades of trying to do project. Ariel, we worked on this kind of project-based cooperation to reduce emissions in Russia, and it goes on. Then, I mean, what kind of trust could there be found, even if the war was hopefully over, and even if we had a different kind of regime?
Tatiana, does it make any sense to talk about climate policies in the Russian energy companies? Do they have any time for thought about that these days?
You see, it's very controversial because the official messages are like excluding themselves. On one hand, the Ministry of Economic Development still insists that net zero by 2060 is the goal. Yeah, nobody has refused it from it officially. And the whole decarbonization strategy is under development, and all the targets are still there. On the other hand, the government is like freezing all the environmental regulation for a year, and I assume it will be prolonged, so no penalties, nothing for methane emissions, for gas flaring, for any leakages or whatever. I mean, the government has recently introduced a Euro 0 standard for the cars. Can you imagine it? I even didn't know that could be such way. Yeah. So of course, when we are talking about the wartime, the priorities are shifting. The real priorities of the government, yeah, and the real priorities of the companies. All the companies which have declared net zero or other less ambitious climate targets, formally they are still in place, and the companies are still publishing very nice sustainability reports, and they have conferences and discussions. So this whole process is ongoing. Yeah? But at the same time, you understand that the real challenge for them at the moment is just to survive, to sustain their logistics, yeah, to find the new markets, actually to find how to replace the European insurance companies, how to bypass the financial restrictions, how to execute payments, how to obtain spare parts for their equipment, how to obtain legal and other consultancy, which is now under sanctions and cannot be provided for the Russian companies, and many, many other very urgent operational issues. Which means that, yeah, climate is formally there, but it is moving somewhere in the end of the list, and the resources are not really allocated. And I think, as you've mentioned, even before the war, there was a lot of greenwashing and this fake activity just to indicate that we are like doing something. Yeah. Right now, I think it will all end up in this area of reporting that we are still interested in climate, but actually I assume that the real emissions from the Russian energy sector will increase for a very simple physical reason that, first of all the transportation routes are becoming much longer, yeah, and all the processes are actually becoming far less efficient, yeah. And then, actually, when you have to reduce gas production with such speed, yeah, so dramatically, when you have to redirect flows with such urgency, I mean, I cannot imagine how it can be done without growing methane emissions, without growing total CO2 emissions. So here, I'm afraid, lack of enforcement from the government and environmental agencies, together with these physical constraints and logistical problems and lack of prioritization, they will end up in much higher emissions, actually, this year, next year. I think it's inevitable.
Pretty bleak outlook there. Yes, before we open up for questions from the hall, you may start thinking about them. It's one issue I'd like to hear more about. Jackie, you focused on pipeline gas exports, which of course is the main part of Russian gas exports. But Russian LNG production and exports have increased quite rapidly the last few years. Does Russian LNG, can it come to have a different role than pipeline gas, you think, in the future, in the market? Will it be more welcome?
I think it is more welcome. It continues to be welcome in Europe. So for those who are not familiar, Russia effectively has two large-scale LNG export terminals. One in the Far East on the island of Sakhalin, which is exclusively directing its exports to Asia. And then in the far northwest of Russia on the Yamal Peninsula, there is Yamal LNG. Now, from Yamal, the exports are directed in two routes, really. During the summertime, when the Northern Sea route is relatively ice-free, they export to Asia. During the winter months, when passage via the Northern Sea route is not possible, we see more exports to Europe. What has happened in recent months with very high European prices is that the Asian premium has disappeared and more of this Yamal LNG has actually found its way into Europe and stayed there. It got stuck. I would say that LNG is perceived differently for a couple of reasons. Firstly, with the pipeline gas, obviously Gazprom is a state-owned company with very strong and close ties to the government, so it's seen as politically less acceptable, let's say. Whereas the Yamal LNG project is led by Novatek, which is a private Russian company, in partnership with Total Energies from France, CNPC, and the Silk Road Fund from China. So it's a little bit different in terms of who is involved. In terms of the extent to which those exports are funding the war in Ukraine, some of the discussion earlier today has touched on the fact that pipeline gas from Russia is subject to a 30% export duty. So when Russian gas is sold into Europe, tax is paid on it twice. Firstly, in terms of the mineral extraction tax, and then secondly, on this export duty. But as Tatiana has pointed out, even this pales into insignificance relative to the scale of Russia's oil export revenues. LNG is not subject to an export duty. There is a mineral extraction tax, but actually the non-Gazprom gas producers pay a lower rate of mineral extraction tax. This is all part of the Russian government's efforts to develop Russia's LNG industry over recent years. So for those reasons, I would say that LNG is perceived differently. And that is why, even in the present circumstances, when European companies are trying to actively reduce their imports of pipeline Russian gas, we are still seeing plenty of Russian LNG arriving into Northwest Europe, and I would expect that it would continue to do so.
Interesting paradox there. Is there any burning questions among the participants in the panel, or should we open the floor? David.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to mention that, of course, this cooperation with Russia right now on environmental issues would not be in the cards. But the climate goals are to make sure that climate temperatures don't increase more than 2 degrees centigrade relative to pre-industrial age levels by the year 2100. So this is a long-run goal. And if we go back to post-World War II, the World Bank and the IMF were formed in late 1945. Germany was not invited to join. However, Germany joined in 1952 and is now the 4th largest shareholder in the World Bank. Similarly, with the GATT, Germany was not invited to be a founding member. GATT was formed in 1948, but Germany joined in 1951. So the world changes. Now we had regime change in Germany, of course, and maybe that's what's required in Russia. But we would hope that eventually we'll be able to cooperate with Russia on climate goals as well as other things. Certainly that's my hope. But my subject is broader than simply Russia's environmental goals. It's a global problem. A clean atmosphere is a global public good from which no country can be excluded, regardless of what they're doing. And so many countries are free riding on the efforts of European nations especially, and some others. And so we'd like to get as many of them in. And frankly, the CBAM is a very inefficient method of controlling emissions because it only controls the carbon embedded in exports and only to the coalition countries which are imposing the CBAM. You really want to impose wherever fuel is burning, wherever carbon dioxide is being emitted into the atmosphere, you need to have regulations against that, and that's mostly domestic. So you need to get countries to impose domestic regulation in order to control this. That's a fundamental economics principle, and all the models that estimate this suggest that. So I don't see the argument from an economic perspective to avoid this, and it's a question is a puzzle to me, and I think I understand it, why the global community has not proceeded, and you can hear it from the rhetoric of the European Union when it comes to the CBAM. They were going to make sure that the CBAM is WTO consistent. And I understand that. I'm a strong supporter of the WTO myself. And as I said, I think one of the innovations of this paper is that you can make it WTO compatible. There is something called an exception within the GATT for health reasons, and you could argue that a clean atmosphere contributes to health, and dirty atmosphere would be unhealthful. So that applies to any country that's not currently in regulating their carbon emissions.
Thank you. You had a short, very brief remark on that?
Yeah. Actually, so first of all, we've discussed, the panelists of the previous session, they've discussed that actually, I think nobody in this room believes that this conflict will end really soon, and that Russia will, that there could be regime change or any major reassessment of the political course anytime soon. Yeah, we are talking most likely, unfortunately, about very long process. And as I've tried to show, Russia's oil and gas revenues, they will be substantial for several years to come, maybe a decade to come, to sustain this economic model. Yeah, probably without growth, without some progress, but it is pretty resilient. Yeah, this economy is resilient, and unless some domestic political coup, yeah, it can survive for a very long time in Iran-style model. Yeah, and differently from Iran, Russia, from the very beginning, has very strong technical capabilities. And so I see already that this mobilization model, yeah, I'm talking not about military mobilization, but economic mobilization, it is actually, there is quite a lot of enthusiasm inside the country, like this making Russia great again and all this stuff. Yeah, and many very talented people, they stay in the country and they choose to work for the regime in order to develop new technologies, import replacement, and all this stuff. So it is there, and it can survive for a very long time. Back to the climate question. So if it's not something that will change in the next couple of years, if it is there for a longer period, then the question for the global community is how, nevertheless, to affect the decision-making on this territory so that it is more climate-friendly. Yeah, and here I'm afraid that none of the EU or US or UK driven proposals or ideas could be accepted in Russia. So most likely they will just irritate and create even more tensions and opposition. But at the same time, I see some signs, especially from the Russian companies, that they are trying to establish better relationships in Asia. And they are very closely looking at the climate regulation evolving in the Asian markets. And you see that there is carbon trading in China, there are some green initiatives in the other non-OECD Asian countries. And so these could become the real bridge which can be built through Asia, actually, to get Russia engaged in some climate initiatives. But again, keep in mind that even before the war, the discussion, domestic discussion in Russia was that we do not accept international standards, we do not accept international reporting systems, we have to develop our own, because we disagree on the role of forests, we disagree on the assessment of methane emissions, and so on and so forth. So again, Russia's special way on disclosure, reporting, verification, Russia's own verification agency, and all this stuff. So anyway, Russia didn't plan from the very beginning to get integrated completely into the international system. Yeah? And now it is just becoming completely impossible. Yeah? So it will be some very strange way of disclosing data and probably no way to verify it.
Jack, you had a brief comment?
Yes, so I had a brief comment to follow up on Tatiana's comments around the resilience of Russia. In gas terms, by the way, traditionally, it's been said before that the tax revenues from gas exports are somewhat marginal compared to the oil export revenues. But a key thing to note here is that Gazprom acted as a vehicle for a subsidy transfer. Gazprom made huge profits selling gas in Europe, and on the back of that, it was able to sell gas at very low regulated prices within Russia. Now, in terms of Russia's resilience going forward as to how that model continues, Gazprom has already made its investments in gas production, but now with the curtailing of its exports to Europe, Gazprom has plenty of gas going forward, so it can continue selling gas at pretty low prices domestically without worrying that it needs more money to invest in more gas production. So Gazprom's not going to face a shortage. And then just briefly as well, following up David, the short-term impact of this, we shouldn't, from a climate perspective, we should keep this in mind, that the curtailment of Russian gas supplies to Europe has had a displacement effect. Europe has suddenly exhibited a much greater need to import liquefied natural gas, but because the global LNG supply has not grown as quickly as European imports have grown, we've effectively been outbidding buyers in other poorer parts of the world that have then been burning more coal. So the net environmental impact is pretty negative. Long term, this looks like we are locking in high gas prices for at least the next several years because of the tightness of the world market and what Europe needs to import. The question is, are we going to see deindustrialization to any great extent in Europe, or companies moving outside of Europe where they can burn fuels more freely and more cheaply? So it's just a question to raise.
You bring in a new dimension. I think we have to stay in Russia. Do you have a comment?
I can comment, but we can also start asking.
We take. Yeah. Well, let me see. Do I see any hands here in the audience here? Some there on the third row.
Thank you. I'm Ramadan from the Egyptian Embassy again. Thanks for the panelists. I think it's a very rich panel. Thank you very much for your insights. Maybe to Jack, the point of how do you foresee that the European need of energy in general, gas in particular, can be fulfilled in the coming 2 years or so? I know there is a work done by Norway, by Egypt, by Algeria, by Qatar, but I think in total that I don't have the figure, but I don't expect that to be more than 20 to 30% of Europe needs. Of course, there will be adjustment in the consumption and so on, but how far you foresee that problem to be managed? Two is on the WTO point. I think that just to help the thinking here, that apart from Article 20 GATT on the exception, either for national security or health condition or environmental even situation, there is Article 13 of the WTO agreement itself on the non-application. I don't think that that article have any specific reason for the non-application. I'm not sure if it has security on it or not, but there is also the suspension of the application in Article 13 in WTO agreement itself, not in GATT of 48. Thank you very much.
Well, that was two questions in one, so I think we will take, and we can't go into too much technicalities of the legal framework here, but I think Jack and then David.
Okay, so I will try to keep my answer brief. But if we imagine where Europe gets its gas from, and by the way, I define Europe here as the EU plus the UK, so I'm excluding Turkey, mainly for lack of granular daily data. We get our gas obviously through domestic production, which has been on a long-term decline. The rate of that decline is now slowing simply because the decline in Dutch gas production has slowed with the phasing out of the Groningen gas field. In terms of our pipeline imports from near neighbors, Norway is pretty much at its full capacity now. Azerbaijan, through the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, is also at its full capacity. The imports from North Africa, well, from Libya, they're pretty constrained by domestic developments. And in terms of what we get from Algeria, there is pipeline capacity, but it seems that their domestic balance between their own production and their own consumption means that they don't have enough left over to fill those export pipelines. So we're pretty constrained, and the situation with Russia is what it is, which means that we need a combination of LNG and demand reductions to help balance the market. Now that means obviously that Europe is exposed to a very tight global LNG market, and all of our forecasts suggest that that global market will stay tight until 2025, 26, maybe 27. Simple reason being that's the point at which the Qatari expansion plans come online, but also in North America, any FIDs taken on LNG export projects in the next 12 months could come to fruition at that time. So simply put, my expectation is that we are going to be in a tight situation for at least the next several years.
David, did you have any comment on that?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, we actually did look at multiple ways to go through the WTO and make it WTO compatible. Nordhaus asked for an amendment to the WTO rules to allow the Climate Club. There have only been two amendments that have ever gone through the WTO. They both took 20 years. The Trade Facilitation Agreement faced considerable opposition from developing countries that ultimately got through by allowing developing countries to essentially opt out if they don't feel they have the capacity to implement it. And so it's a long process, and this proposal violates Article 1 and Article 2 of the GATT. It's the bedrock principle of the GATT and the WTO, most favored nation, and violation of the bound tariffs. So this would be very controversial to get it through as an amendment. But it may be, so I suggest that you pursue it, but do something immediate as well. With the exception, it can be implemented immediately. Any country can and then some other member country has to object, and it goes to dispute settlement. And until that dispute settlement panel rules against it, you can apply these tariff surcharges. And right now, the dispute settlement panel usually takes 3 or 4 years, and right now the dispute settlement panel is not functioning. There are no judges to make the final decision. So we don't have a dispute settlement panel right now in the WTO. So until it gets restored, and there's a major political issue on this, as the reason it doesn't exist, there's not going to be any negative rulings against under the dispute settlement panel.
But there is some movement, I think, in this intellectually and academically, and maybe politically. I think we have to see if there are other. Yeah, you have a red light on your mic there, so you can.
Yeah. First, I'd like to point out my Yahoo article.
Please introduce yourself.
First, I'd like to point out my Yahoo article, Lou Coatney, Russia now left with no choice but nuclear war. And the Russians are preparing for a strategic nuclear war, their civil defenses. Secondly, we're the aggressors in Ukraine. Kiev 2014 was a coup for 4 obvious reasons. We started the war. The best analogy of the Ukraine war I've seen is 2 fools arguing over deck chairs on the sinking Titanic, the Titanic being the environment. Greta Thunberg is so disgusted, she's...
The question, please. Do you have a question?
Okay. How can we deal with the environment if we have disunified the world with this Ukraine war, which the rest of the world community does not approve of? They're not going along with anti-Russian resolutions at these economic conferences.
Thank you. Other hands in the audience? Yes, it is. Yeah, was it somebody up there? No. You have to raise your hand. Yeah, stop, please. Yep, here.
Thank you. I read an article back in March where it said South Korea had problems by exchanging the Russian oil with other types of oil because of the quality. And I wonder, it's just a simple question actually, how easy is it to exchange one type of oil with another one? Because it might affect how easily other countries can import Russian oil.
Do you see other questions? Indra, please.
Indra Ørland from NUPI.
I don't think it's on.
Is it off? Okay. Indra Ørland from NUPI. I am wondering, so with the sanctions, the international companies are withdrawing from the Russian petroleum sector, and I'm wondering how long will it take before that has an effect on Russian oil and gas output?
Yes, we have 3 questions here. Tatiana, I think some of them are directed to you.
Okay. So first of all, on your question about the oil quality, indeed, that's a limitation. That's a limitation not only for the Russian oil exports, but also for all redirecting of flows between Russia, Middle East, and the rest of the world. It's really challenging, and I assume that there will be some significant changes in the structure of the global refining capacities because of this situation. Yeah, so Russia will increasingly send its oil to Asia. Right now, China and India seem to reach already the limit of the offtake, which doesn't require any adjustments at the refineries. Yeah? But in the longer term, I assume they will make these adjustments. At the same time, the Middle East will increasingly send its oil to Europe, which will also require Europe to make these adjustments at the refineries, which is also inevitable because if Europe is not planning to receive Russian oil, and oil from Iran and Venezuela also doesn't seem to be available, so those heavy source of oil, then it will have to readjust its capacities. So yeah, it requires some additional investments, but given the current price for oil products, I think it is something doable. On your question, can you repeat the formulation?
When does the withdrawal of Western international oil companies have
Yeah.
12 or 6 years or 16 years?
Frankly, I do not think that it will affect dramatically. Yeah, because as I said, so gas production is already declining. Oil production went down by 12% without changes in oil exports. Yeah? So these 12 to 20%, these are the volumes which are corresponding to the real influence of the foreign companies in the Russian oil and gas industry. So I don't think that Russia will restore those volumes anytime soon, at least when we are talking about this decade, I don't expect it. And the projects which are terminated first are the most expensive and technologically sophisticated, so all offshore, heavy to produce oil, and all this stuff. And basically, Russia doesn't need them now. I mean, these complicated technologies and these sophisticated projects. So they will be simply stopped. Yeah, and this process actually started back in 2014 with the previous round of sanctions. Without a Western finance, actually we can see that Russian oil and gas industry is surviving pretty well. So the current financial capabilities are more than sufficient to sustain the current levels. So it's only about critical technologies. And I would say that since 2014, Russia has actually succeeded in localizing quite many of the oil and gas technologies. I don't know about the weapons and other things, but in oil and gas, most of the catalysts are now produced at home, which was not the case before 2014. The technologies for horizontal drilling and most of the pumps are produced at home. There are problems with the fracking equipment, but again, they are localizing. At least Gazprom Neft has put a lot of effort during the previous 8 years specifically on these technologies. And as international service companies are moving away from Russia, actually they are leaving all their plants and equipment and people, all the personnel is still inside the country. So they change the label. It is, I mean, Halliburton is no longer there, but the plant keeps working. And the people, the engineers who are capable of providing those services are still there if they are not mobilized at the military service, which is another story. So basically, I would say that in addition to that, all gray import schemes, yeah, they are flourishing, I don't know, through Kazakhstan, through Turkey, through Abu Dhabi, it's all ongoing. And Chinese equipment, yeah, so basically, I don't see any real threat for the Russian oil and gas production in the foreseeable future because of these technological and financial sanctions. The only critical point are gas turbines, both for the power sector and for LNG liquefaction, and now, amazingly, Iran steps in as the major provider of these gas turbines. So that looks pretty strange, but that's the case.
Thank you. Very, very detailed and I think very current, up-to-date information you're giving us there, Tatiana. There was also a question more sort of more philosophical about the impact on environment and climate. Anybody cares to?
Sure, yeah. I would also add to Tatiana's point, to Indra's question, I think the crunch point will come when Russia's onshore and relatively easy to access oil resources are more significantly depleted, and then the point at which, without all of the sanctions, Russia would have started to engage in deep water offshore and Arctic oil drilling. I think that will be extremely challenging on the basis of Russia's domestic technology. It's something they would have intended to do with foreign technology, and now that door is closed to them. The more philosophical question about dealing with the present situation, if you like, whilst all the while in the background the climate situation is getting worse. I think the simple answer is we have to be multitasking on this, because there are very urgent questions that have to be addressed today, whilst also keeping in mind that every year that passes without really comprehensive action on decarbonization, then the climate challenge gets worse and worse. But I think just because we have a climate challenge doesn't mean that we can let other issues just go by the wayside, if you like, and say, oh, well, we still want Russia's gas, so therefore, fine, go ahead and invade Ukraine. Just don't turn off the taps, I think we have to keep both in mind. And, let's face it, in the short term, yes, this, Russian invasion of Ukraine has had negative environmental impacts through displacement of gas coming off the market, being replaced to a certain extent by coal, increased coal consumption in Europe, increased coal consumption outside of Europe. But I think in the present situation, there is no choice to the present course of action.
Is there any? Yes, we have one there in the middle. Yep, please.
So Sunniva Storm, MOD. My question relates to the Altai pipeline and your thoughts about the future of it, especially in regards to the discussion of the route going through Mongolia or around. So both on the potential future of it and also the potential implications.
Yeah, just to clarify, you're referring to the planned or proposed pipeline from West Siberia to
yes, and also
to Western China.
Yeah.
Who would you?
I can take this, unless Tatiana, you would like to.
You can start, and I will add.
Okay, sure. So I think again, just a point of clarification for those in the room who are less familiar: the existing Power of Siberia pipeline from Russia to China has as its resource base 2 gas fields in eastern Siberia, Kovykta and Chayanda. They are not connected to the rest of Russia's national pipeline system. So those are only being used to supply some, relatively small demand in the local areas, but mainly exports to China. Clearly the plan with, whether it's the Altai pipeline or Power of Siberia 2 via Mongolia, is to connect Russia's gas production on the Yamal Peninsula with a Chinese export market. I think the major challenge of this is, first of all, the route of the pipeline. Let's not forget that the Power of Siberia 1, the binding contracts were signed in May 2014, just at a time when Russia needed some geopolitical gesture to prove that it had friends outside of Europe when it was being sanctioned in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea and the backing of separatists in eastern Ukraine. Maybe we were in a similar situation now, that from a Russian geostrategic perspective, they want to be able to show the world that, well, okay, Europe, you don't want our gas, we don't need you anyway. But it took 5.5 years to go from that signing of the agreement in May 2014 to the launch of the Power of Siberia in December 2019. So even if binding agreements were signed tomorrow, this is not something we're going to see until the late 2020s. And in terms of a balance of power negotiations, let's face it, the Chinese are going to hold a very strong hand in terms of negotiating with Gazprom and the Russian government over what they're willing to pay. So I think it's something that could happen. And actually, in climate terms, a nice little side to this is you could provide substantial gas supplies to Mongolia and ease the climate situation there, given not just the climate situation, but the local pollution situation, given how dependent they are on coal as a source of fuel. But I will pass on to Tatiana to build on that.
I will add only that. Indeed, so nobody is talking about Altai project any longer. It's Power of Siberia 2 with official name Soyuz Vostok, and it's supposed to go through Mongolia. The problem is that China is actually not confirming this route, and there is so Russia is fulfilling pre-feasibility study and says that it is working on the project development, but there are no signals from the Chinese side that they actually accept this idea. So it is a very controversial story, and actually, the whole Chinese role in the recent developments of the Russian energy sector is very controversial. Just before the war, remember, Putin was visiting Beijing for the Olympics, and they've signed an agreement with China on the new gas pipeline from Sakhalin, which is basically built. It was built for the supplies of Vladivostok. It just has to be expanded. And since then, there were no new major agreements between Russia and China in the area of energy. despite all the huge opportunities which were showing up with the withdrawal of the international companies with Russia. So there were plenty of opportunities for the Chinese companies to step in, to take over, I don't know, Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2, to take over other assets which were left in the Russian oil, gas and power sector, the crown jewels, actually. Chinese companies were not stepping in. None of the projects which were already under discussion has moved forward. So nothing. China is actually keeping very neutral and very, very cautious in this specific area. So it is also a sign that it's quite different compared to the situation of 2014. Russia would love to have strategic friend in the East, but actually strategic friend in the East is not happy to do that.
Very good that this question was asked, because we have an opportunity to bring in that very important element in the discussion. We are approaching the end. Is there any burning question in the audience? It has to come up now. Yes, Jakub.
Jakub Godzimirski from NUPI. It's not a question, but rather a comment. I think that there is also a certain level of cautiousness in Moscow, because on the one hand, Russia has been severing its ties to Europe. That is based on, the European project is based on those liberal and democratic values and norms, while getting closer to China could also pose a strategic challenge, long-term strategic challenge to Russia, because when we look at the disparity of economic potentials, of demographic potentials, and the way China is dealing with its international surroundings, then in the longer term perspective, it could be that this cooperation with Europe could turn out to be more profitable for Russia in the long term perspective than becoming a kind of lesser and smaller brother of this Chinese empire, global empire. So this is also a dimension that needs to be understood.
Well, it was a comment. I think you have outlined the theme for the next conference. I'd like to ask if there are any final remark you want to make. I think we touched on many very relevant components of this picture. We managed to also get it into the global arena by way of David Tarr's introduction and comments. And I think there is some agreement here that the outlook for the climate part of this session is not so good in the short term, but it's very important to keep the long-term perspective, as David underlined. Tatiana, you felt?
Yeah, I mean, I have always this problem with the climate discussion these days about Russia, because look, climate or sustainability, because as long as SDG 16 is missing, yeah, the whole discussion, it is not actually that relevant. And we see already so many consequences of the military actions, which are absolutely terrible. And one explosion of the Nord Stream has already produced such huge methane emissions that many of the efforts made by Russia previously in reduction of these emissions, they are just wiped away. And then, look, we are now talking, actually we are witnessing enormous bombing of the whole infrastructure in Ukraine. Yeah, which also has terrible environmental consequences. And there are also these really very frightening situations around nuclear power plants in Ukraine, especially Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which can result in a terrible another disaster. Yeah, so I just want to put it all into the perspective that the first and most important challenge here is really associated with the ongoing military conflict, yeah? And all the other things, they do matter, but I really doubt that it would be possible to really go for the realistic, not fake reduction of emissions before the peace is achieved.
Thank you, Tatiana. Then you bring back the issue to the starting point for the conference this year, which is, of course, is the war and its various impacts. But the war is ongoing, and the solution there is very, very important for all the other issues we have discussed. Thank you very much.
Okay. I have the task of giving a brief closing to the conference. So my name is Indra Øvland, and I'm a research professor at NUPI. I'm supposed to sum up everything that has been said today, but I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to add just a few remarks from my side, like listening to the very interesting conversations today. And my main remark is that I see a great challenge in trying to analyze Russia's trajectory now. And the challenge is between two different perspectives. On the one hand, Russia is facing and is going through the perfect storm. So it has launched this terrible and meaningless war against its neighbor. It's losing a very large number of Russian lives. Sanctions, the cost of war itself, the destabilization of the Russian economy, and so on. Many, many big challenges. And some people, I think, would say that this heightens the risk of some political upheaval in Russia. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there is a risk of mixing up our analysis of Russia's trajectory with what one wants to happen. So many people would like to see a change of government in Russia, and maybe a revolution or some kind of conflict among the elites. And I think there's a long history of getting such desires mixed up with one's analysis, and one has to be careful to keep them apart. So, I recognize this dilemma. Nonetheless, to make sure we finish on an interesting note, I'm going to go out on a limb and call this. And I'm going to say that I think that over the next 12 months, I do think that there is a considerable risk of major political upheaval inside Russia. I agree that the energy sector and the sanctions are not the main driver of this risk. I think they are important factors, but I think other factors are perhaps more important. I think the very unsuccessful military campaign is perhaps the most important factor, and I think we've seen some of the problems that this special military operation is experiencing, and I think we are going to see a lot more. And I think the impact of mobilization inside Russia on the economy, on industry, industrial development, on computing in the ICT sector, and I think also the impact of the war on the standard of living in a broad sense, not just economic, but also in terms of freedom to travel, freedom within Russian society. And I think one of the most dramatic effects of the war is going to be on the birth rate. And I think we're going to see that about 9 months after the mobilization, which started in September. So I think by June, July, August, we're going to see some very dramatic numbers concerning the birth rate in Russia. Not just because a lot of eligible young men have left the country, more might be trying to stay low inside Russia, and others may not be staying low, but other couples may decide that maybe now is not the time to have a baby, or another baby, or whatever. And I think that's a very problematic development for any society, especially a society like Russia, which many countries, like many countries in the world, has had a low birth rate for a long time. And I also think the impact on as it starts to sink in the impact on the standing of Russia and of Russians in the world, and on the internal dynamic inside the OECD countries in terms of attitudes to Russia, which I think has been fundamentally transformed by the invasion of Ukraine. I think all of these factors, in addition to developments in the energy sector and sanctions, increase the risks of political upheaval in the next 12 months. And if it doesn't happen, which is also very perfectly possible, I think 3-4 years down the road, even more of these factors should be heightening the risk even more. I may easily be wrong. At least my point is empirically verifiable over time. Thanks to all of you to coming to the 27th annual Russia conference of NUPI. Thanks to Arild and the Fridtjof Nansen Institute for co-organizing it this year with us. Thanks to some of the world's best experts on the Russian economy and energy sector for coming to Oslo and having this conversation with us. Thanks to the Research Council of Norway for paying for all of this. And on that note, I finished the conference, and lunch will be served downstairs in the basement. Thank you.